The cold light of the morning of June 6, 1944, brought with it the deafening roar of thousands of aircraft tearing through the skies over Normandy. As the largest amphibious landing in history unfolded on the French beaches, one man was absent from the theater of operations he himself had helped fortify. Erwin Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox, commander of Army Group B responsible for defending the Atlantic Wall, was not at his command post. He had departed for Germany days earlier, convinced that adverse weather conditions would make any Allied invasion impossible at that moment. It was an absence that would become one of the most debated turning points of World War II. When Rommel finally returned to France on June 15, 1944, 9 days after D-Day, the panorama he encountered was one of calculated and systematic devastation. The beaches he had obsessively traversed months before, inspecting every bunker, every anti-tank obstacle, every meter of barbed wire, were now firmly under Allied control. More than 326,000 soldiers had landed, establishing a beachhead that grew with each passing hour. The Allies had punctured the Atlantic Wall, that pharaonic work of concrete and steel that was supposed to be impregnable. And Rommel, the military architect of that defense, knew exactly what this meant. The war was lost. What transpired in the following days between Rommel and Adolf Hitler was not merely a military debate about tactics and strategies. It was the final confrontation between two incompatible visions of reality. On one side stood a pragmatic general who had witnessed firsthand the crushing material superiority of the Allies, who had seen his armored divisions destroyed from the air before they could even reach the battlefield, who understood that Germany was fighting a war it could not win. On the other, a delusional dictator, prisoner of his own mythology, incapable of accepting any narrative that was not one of final victory, sustained by miracle weapons and the force of Germanic will. Rommel had changed. The general who had returned from North Africa in 1943, still bearing the aura of invincibility earned in the Libyan sands, had been transformed by the brutal reality of total war. He had witnessed Allied air supremacy turn highways into graveyards of twisted metal. He had seen entire cities reduced to rubble by strategic bombing. He had observed young German soldiers, poorly trained and poorly equipped, being massacred by an enemy with seemingly unlimited resources. The experience had eroded his faith in Hitler's leadership and in the manifest destiny of the Third Reich. The meeting between Rommel and Hitler took place on June 17, 1944, at the Führer's headquarters in Berchtesgaden, known as the Berghof. Rommel had traveled alongside Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, supreme commander of German forces in the West, both summoned to explain the failure to repel the invasion. The atmosphere was one of veiled recrimination. Hitler, surrounded by his court of sycophants and ideologues, was determined to find scapegoats for a defeat that his own tactical interference had made inevitable. He had insisted on keeping armored reserves under his direct control, denying field commanders the flexibility necessary to respond quickly to the invasion. When he finally authorized the movement of the precious panzer divisions, it was already too late. Allied aviation had shredded them on the roads. What Rommel actually said during that encounter has been the subject of historical debate, filtered through partial memoirs, incomplete documents, and the fog of both Nazi and Allied propaganda. But the essential core of his words, preserved in military reports, diaries of officers present, and post-war testimonies, reveals an extraordinary confrontation. Rommel did not merely report the military situation with brutal frankness. He crossed a line that few dared to traverse in Hitler's presence. He told the naked, unvarnished truth about Germany's strategic situation. According to records, Rommel presented a devastating assessment. The Atlantic Wall had been irreversibly penetrated. German forces in Normandy were being systematically destroyed by Allied material superiority. For every German tank destroyed or liter of fuel consumed, the Allies could field 10 new tanks and unlimited supplies. The Luftwaffe, once dominant, was a pathetic shadow of itself, incapable of challenging the total air control of the Anglo-Americans. German supply lines were being strangled. Reinforcement divisions were being decimated before reaching the front. And most disturbing of all, troop morale was disintegrating. But Rommel went beyond military analysis. He began speaking about Germany's broader political and strategic situation. The war in the East was transforming into catastrophe, with the Red Army advancing implacably. German industrial production was under constant bombardment. Cities were being turned into ruins night after night. And, in an audacity that left some of those present pale, Rommel began suggesting the unthinkable. Germany needed to consider a political solution. It was necessary to seek an armistice to end the war while there was still something of the Reich left to preserve. Hitler's reaction to Rommel's assessment was predictable yet chilling in its detachment from reality. The Führer's face, according to witnesses, contorted with rage barely contained beneath a veneer of icy control. His hands trembled, the visible manifestation of the neurological deterioration that had been accelerating since the failed assassination attempt that would come weeks later. But in that moment, on June 17, 1944, Hitler was still the absolute master of the Third Reich, and he would tolerate no deviation from the narrative of inevitable German victory. Rommel's words were not merely unwelcome, they were heretical, a direct challenge to the mystical faith that sustained the entire Nazi edifice. Hitler launched into one of his characteristic monologues, a torrent of ideology mixed with wishful thinking and detached strategic fantasies. He spoke of new weapons that would turn the tide of war, the V-1 flying bombs that had just begun raining down on London, the coming V-2 rockets, jet fighters that would sweep Allied bombers from the skies, new U-boats with revolutionary technology. He invoked the historical precedent of Frederick the Great, who had faced impossible odds yet emerged victorious through sheer willpower and the miraculous collapse of the enemy coalition. Germany would do the same. The alliance between the capitalist West and the communist East was unnatural, he insisted. It would fracture, and Germany would exploit that fracture. All that was required was fanatical resistance, buying time for the miracle weapons to arrive and for the enemy alliance to shatter under its own contradictions. Rommel listened with growing frustration and, according to some accounts, barely concealed contempt. This was not the first time he had heard these delusions, but the gap between Hitler's fantasies and the reality Rommel had witnessed in Normandy was now unbridgeable. The field marshal tried again, his voice reportedly taking on a harder edge. He spoke of concrete realities, the impossibility of moving troops in daylight due to Allied air supremacy, the chronic fuel shortages that left panzer divisions immobilized, the catastrophic losses that could not be replaced, the fact that Germany was being bled white on 3 fronts simultaneously. He mentioned the suffering of the German civilian population under the relentless bombing campaign, the cities turned to ash, the infrastructure collapsing. Then Rommel said something that would seal his fate, though he likely did not realize it at the time. He suggested, with what witnesses described as unusual directness, that Germany's political leadership needed to draw conclusions from the military situation. The implication was unmistakable. Hitler himself needed to consider ending the war through negotiation. Some accounts suggest Rommel used even more direct language, speaking of the need for political change, for opening channels to the Western Allies, for recognizing that continued resistance would only lead to Germany's complete destruction. The room fell silent. Those present, generals, adjutants, Nazi party officials, understood they had just witnessed something extraordinary and dangerous. No one spoke to Hitler this way. The Führer's cult of personality was absolute, maintained through a combination of genuine devotion, fear of the Gestapo, and the psychological dynamics of authoritarian systems where truth becomes whatever the leader declares it to be. Rommel had shattered that dynamic with the blunt instrument of military reality. Hitler's response was ice. He rejected Rommel's assessment entirely, not with military counterarguments, but with ideological pronouncements. The field marshal did not understand the bigger picture, Hitler suggested. He was thinking like a mere military technician, focused on materiel and logistics, when what was required was faith in the German spirit, in the superiority of Nazi socialist willpower over Allied materialism. Hitler invoked the stab-in-the-back myth from World War I, the Nazi fiction that Germany had not been defeated militarily, but betrayed by weak politicians who sued for peace. He would not repeat that mistake. Germany would fight to the last man, the last bullet, the last city block if necessary. But there was something else in Hitler's demeanor, something that several witnesses later remarked upon, a sense that the Führer himself no longer fully believed his own mythology. His rages were becoming more theatrical, his promises more desperate. The man who had once radiated manic confidence now seemed to be performing confidence for an audience that was increasingly skeptical. Hitler had constructed a reality bubble so complete that penetrating it with truth had become almost impossible. Yet Rommel had just forced him to glimpse the abyss, and Hitler's response was to retreat even deeper into delusion, to double down on the fantasies that sustained him. The meeting ended without resolution. Rommel was not dismissed from command, not yet, but he had been marked. Hitler's suspicion, once aroused, was permanent. The Führer had surrounded himself with yes-men and true believers precisely to avoid moments like this. Rommel had always been different, a genuine military talent who had achieved celebrity status both in Germany and internationally, someone whose reputation gave him a dangerous degree of independence. Now that independence had manifested as dissent, and in Hitler's paranoid worldview, dissent was indistinguishable from treason. Rommel returned to France deeply shaken. He confided to his staff that Hitler was living in a fantasy world, disconnected from reality, unwilling to face the truth of Germany's situation. The field marshal began speaking more openly with trusted subordinates about the need for action, though what kind of action remained ambiguous. Was he merely advocating for military realism, for permission to conduct tactical withdrawals and preserve forces? Or was he beginning to contemplate something more radical, a fundamental change in Germany's political leadership? The answer would come soon enough. Within weeks, Rommel would be approached by members of the conspiracy to assassinate Hitler, the plot that would culminate in the failed bombing of July 20, 1944. Rommel's exact level of involvement remains debated by historians, but his confrontation with Hitler in June had clearly pushed him toward the resistance. He had seen that Hitler would never change course voluntarily, that the dictator would drag Germany into complete annihilation rather than admit defeat or compromise his ideological vision. The weeks following Rommel's confrontation with Hitler witnessed the field marshal's descent into a psychological twilight zone where duty, pragmatism, and moral awakening collided with devastating force. Back in Normandy, the military situation deteriorated with mechanical precision. The Allied beachhead expanded relentlessly. British and American forces ground forward through the hedgerow country of Bocage, a landscape that favored defense but could not compensate for the overwhelming disparity in resources. Every German counterattack was smashed by naval gunfire and aerial bombardment. Every attempt to bring up reserves was interdicted by fighter bombers that patrolled the skies with impunity. Rommel watched his forces being systematically destroyed, and he understood with crystalline clarity that nothing he could do would change the outcome. During this period, Rommel began writing a series of reports and letters that reveal a man undergoing a profound transformation. To his wife Lucy, he wrote with unusual candor about the hopelessness of the military situation and his growing disillusionment with the Nazi leadership. To his superiors, he filed brutally honest assessments that were ignored or dismissed. In one particularly stark report dated July 15, 1944, just 3 days before he would be catastrophically wounded, Rommel laid out the situation in terms that left no room for misinterpretation. The German forces in Normandy were on the brink of collapse. Losses could not be replaced. Supply lines were interdicted. The Luftwaffe was non-existent. And then, in language that was extraordinarily bold for a serving German officer in 1944, Rommel effectively demanded that Hitler recognize reality and take political action to end the war. This report never reached Hitler in its original form. It was intercepted, sanitized, and diluted by the layers of bureaucracy and ideological gatekeepers that surrounded the Führer. But its existence demonstrates how far Rommel had traveled from the loyal soldier who had once accepted Hitler's strategic genius without question.
The Desert Fox had become something far more dangerous to the regime. A senior military figure who had seen through the illusions and was willing to say so, even if only in official channels. It was during these same weeks that members of the German resistance made contact with Rommel. The conspiracy to assassinate Hitler had been developing for years, driven by a diverse coalition of military officers, aristocrats, civil servants, and clergymen who recognized that the Nazi regime was leading Germany to annihilation. Some were motivated by moral revulsion at Nazi crimes, others by pragmatic recognition that the war was lost, still others by traditional Prussian military values that Hitler had systematically corrupted. What they needed was a figure of sufficient stature and popularity to provide legitimacy to a post-Hitler government, someone who could negotiate with the Allies from a position of respect rather than as a defeated war criminal. Rommel seemed ideal. He was Germany's most famous general, celebrated even by the enemy. He had never been a member of the Nazi Party. His reputation was untainted by the atrocities that stained so many other senior Wehrmacht officers. Though this reputation was partly mythological, carefully constructed by Nazi propaganda and later perpetuated by Allied writers who wanted to believe in the existence of a good German general. The historical reality was more complex. Rommel had benefited enormously from Hitler's patronage, had accepted the systematic exploitation of forced labor in building the Atlantic Wall, and had been willfully blind to the regime's crimes. But in the summer of 1944, the conspirators needed a symbol, and Rommel could serve that purpose. The exact nature of Rommel's involvement with the July 20 plot remains one of World War II's most debated questions. The evidence is fragmentary and contradictory. Several conspirators, including General Karl Heinrich von Stülpnagel and Lieutenant Colonel Cäsar von Hoffacker, met with Rommel and later testified, under Gestapo torture, that he had expressed support for removing Hitler. Rommel's own chief of staff, Hans Speidel, claimed after the war that Rommel had agreed to support the coup but opposed assassination, preferring instead that Hitler be arrested and tried. Other witnesses suggested Rommel's position was more ambiguous, that he expressed sympathy with the goals but avoided committing to specific action. What seems clear is that Rommel had crossed a psychological threshold. He no longer believed in Hitler's leadership. He recognized that the war was lost and that continuing to fight would only multiply German suffering. He was engaging in discussions about political alternatives with men who were plotting high treason. Whether he would have actually joined the conspiracy, whether he would have placed himself at the head of a provisional government, whether he had the moral courage to fully break with the regime that had elevated him, these questions would never be answered, because on July 17, 1944, Rommel's staff car was strafed by British fighter planes on a French country road. The attack was devastating. The driver was killed, the car crashed, and Rommel was thrown onto the pavement, suffering severe head injuries, including a fractured skull and damage to his left eye. He was rushed to a hospital, unconscious and hovering near death. The most celebrated general in the German armed forces was suddenly removed from the board at the most critical moment. 3 days later, on July 20, Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg would detonate a bomb in Hitler's conference room at the Wolf Lair. The Führer would survive with minor injuries. The conspiracy would collapse within hours, and the Nazi regime would unleash a wave of savage repression unlike anything seen before in Germany. As Rommel lay recovering in a hospital, his brain damaged and his future uncertain, the Gestapo was torturing conspirators and extracting names. The investigation spread like a stain, consuming hundreds of suspects, real and imagined. And eventually, inevitably, the interrogators extracted Rommel's name. Multiple conspirators, broken by torture and facing certain death, mentioned conversations with the field marshal, his criticisms of Hitler, his suggestions that the war must be ended politically. The evidence was circumstantial, the testimony obtained through torture and therefore unreliable. But in the paranoid atmosphere of post-assassination attempt Nazi Germany, circumstantial evidence was more than sufficient. Hitler faced a dilemma. Rommel was a national hero, arguably the most popular military figure in Germany. He could not simply be arrested, tried, and executed like the hundreds of lesser conspirators who were being hanged with piano wire at Plötzensee prison, their deaths filmed for Hitler's viewing pleasure. A public trial would risk turning Rommel into a martyr, would expose the regime's fear of dissent, would reveal to the German people that even their most celebrated general had lost faith in the Führer. The solution Hitler devised was characteristically cynical. Rommel would be given a choice between a public trial that would destroy his family's reputation and a private suicide that would preserve his legend and protect his wife and son.
On October 14, 1944, 4 months after his confrontation with Hitler at the Beerhof, and nearly 3 months after the strafing attack that nearly killed him, Erwin Rommel was recovering at his home in Herlingen, a small village near Ulm. His injuries had been severe: the fractured skull, the damaged eye, the neurological trauma that left him with persistent headaches and impaired vision. But he was alive, and he was home with his wife Lucy and their 15-year-old son Manfred. The war had moved on without him. The Normandy front had collapsed in August. Paris had fallen. Allied armies were advancing toward the German frontier. In the east, the Red Army had launched Operation Bagration, destroying Army Group Center and driving deep into Poland. The Reich was contracting, being crushed between two inexorable forces, exactly as Rommel had predicted. But Rommel's personal war was not over. The Gestapo investigation into the July 20 conspiracy had been grinding forward with methodical brutality. Thousands had been arrested. Hundreds had been executed after show trials before the People's Court, where the deranged judge Roland Freisler screamed abuse at defendants before sentencing them to death. The transcripts of tortured conspirators had yielded Rommel's name repeatedly. General Karl Heinrich von Stülpnagel, the military governor of France who had tried to initiate the coup in Paris, had attempted suicide but survived, blinded and brain damaged. In his delirium, he had allegedly called out Rommel's name. Lieutenant Colonel Caesar von Hofacker, under savage torture, had described conversations with Rommel about the need to remove Hitler. Other conspirators mentioned the field marshal in contexts that suggested, at minimum, foreknowledge of dissident activity. Hitler had reviewed the evidence with his characteristic paranoia. He was convinced of Rommel's betrayal, though whether this conviction was based on genuine belief or political convenience is impossible to determine. The Führer, who had once praised Rommel effusively, who had promoted him and decorated him and used him as a propaganda symbol of German military genius, now saw only a traitor. But Hitler understood the propaganda problem. Rommel could not be publicly destroyed without damaging the regime itself. The German people, starved for hope and heroes, had invested enormous emotional capital in the Desert Fox. To reveal that their celebrated general had turned against the Führer would undermine the mythology of national unity that sustained the war effort. The solution was as cynical as it was efficient. On that October morning, 2 generals arrived at Rommel's home: Wilhelm Burgdorf, Hitler's chief military adjutant, and Ernst Maisel, deputy to the army's personnel chief. They carried with them the verdict of Hitler's informal court. Rommel was accused of involvement in the conspiracy to assassinate the Führer. The evidence, they claimed, was overwhelming. But because of his previous service to the Reich, Hitler was offering him a choice: face a public trial before the People's Court, where he would be found guilty, stripped of his honors and executed, with his family facing persecution and disgrace, or take poison immediately, receive a state funeral with full military honors, and have his family's reputation and pension protected. It was not really a choice. It was state-sanctioned murder dressed in the language of mercy. Rommel asked for time to speak with his wife and son. The generals, displaying the bureaucratic coldness that characterized so much of Nazi Germany's brutality, gave him 15 minutes. Rommel went upstairs to say goodbye to Lucy. According to her later testimony, he told her what had happened, explained that the accusations were related to his opposition to continuing the war, and said he would take the poison to protect the family. He was calm, resigned, perhaps even relieved that the moral ambiguity of his position was finally being resolved, however grotesquely. He came back downstairs, embraced his son Manfred briefly, and walked out to the waiting car with the 2 generals. They drove a short distance from the house, stopped on a quiet road, and Burgdorf handed Rommel a vial of cyanide. The field marshal, who had commanded armies across North Africa and France, who had been celebrated as a military genius, who had stood in Hitler's presence just 4 months earlier and dared to speak truth to totalitarian power, swallowed the poison.
He died within seconds. His body was taken to a hospital where a doctor, complicit in the charade, signed a death certificate citing cerebral embolism, a consequence of his earlier injuries. The Nazi propaganda machine swung into action immediately. The official story was a masterpiece of calculated deception. Rommel had died from complications of his war wounds, a hero who had given everything for Germany. Hitler sent an elaborate wreath and a message of condolence, praising Rommel's outstanding services for the Führer and the Reich. Goebbels' propaganda ministry orchestrated a state funeral of grotesque magnificence. Rommel's coffin, draped with the swastika flag, was displayed in Ulm's town hall. Thousands of Germans filed past to pay their respects. Senior Nazi officials delivered eulogies. The charade was perfect, and it would not be fully exposed until after the war, when Lucy and Manfred Rommel revealed the truth. The bitter irony is that Rommel's murder vindicated everything he had said to Hitler in June. By October 1944, the military situation was even more catastrophic than Rommel had predicted. The Western Front was collapsing. The Eastern Front was disintegrating. German cities were being systematically destroyed from the air. The war economy was grinding toward paralysis. And Hitler was planning the Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, a last desperate gamble that would consume Germany's final reserves in a futile attempt to split the Allied armies. Everything Rommel had warned about had come to pass, but Hitler remained committed to fighting until Germany was reduced to rubble. What Rommel really said to Hitler after the Normandy invasion was this: "The war is lost. Continued resistance is pointless. Germany must seek a political solution before everything is destroyed." These were not the words of a defeatist or a coward. They were the words of a professional soldier who had the moral courage to state an unbearable truth in the presence of absolute power. For that honesty, for that momentary rebellion against the cult of delusion that surrounded Hitler, Rommel paid with his life. He was murdered not because he had definitively committed treason, the evidence of his involvement in the July 20 plot remains ambiguous, but because he had committed the ultimate sin in a totalitarian system. He had spoken reality to a dictator who could only function in a world of comforting lies. The tragedy of Rommel extends beyond his personal fate. He represents the moral failure of the German military elite, the officers who served Hitler brilliantly, who enabled his wars of aggression, who closed their eyes to the regime's crimes, and who only began to question their loyalty when defeat became inevitable. Rommel was not a resistance hero in the mold of Stauffenberg or Bonhoeffer. He was a careerist who benefited enormously from Nazi patronage and only turned against the regime when its military incompetence became undeniable. His confrontation with Hitler in June 1944 was not born of moral awakening, but of professional frustration. And yet, in that moment, he showed more courage than countless others who continued to serve Hitler's death cult until the very end. The final irony is that Rommel's manufactured death served Hitler's purposes even as it eliminated a dangerous dissenter. The myth of Rommel the noble warrior, killed by his wounds in service to Germany, sustained morale through the final terrible months of the war. Germans continued to fight with desperate ferocity, believing in the honor of soldiers like Rommel, not knowing that their hero had been murdered by the regime he had served. The lie was maintained, the war continued, and hundreds of thousands more died before Hitler finally ended his own life in a Berlin bunker in April 1945. What Rommel said to Hitler after Normandy was the truth. What Hitler did in response was murder that truth, and the man who dared to speak it. That exchange, more than any single battle or strategic decision, encapsulates the essential character of Nazi Germany. A regime so committed to its own mythology that it would destroy even its greatest servants rather than face reality.